The second season of Barbarians is almost here, so I think it's about time I reviewed the Latin in the second half of Season 1, finally, about 2 years after the show came out. What do you think? Let's dive in. So the actors and the Latin translation of everything in this show, fantastic, all the way. The problem tends to be that the actors, because they don't speak Latin fluently, tend to mess up lots of the aspects of the pronunciation. This is completely understandable. But why is clamosus es?
Clamosus es.
Why does this bother me, and why am I going to talk about it? Because this actor is stressing the s. Now, if I were to say, you're noisy, which is what he's saying, of course, you're noisy, clamosus es. When we say that, you're noisy. It's not you're noisy. It's you're noisy. And if I were to reverse the word order to noisy you are sounds weird, right? And that's how he's saying it, clamosus es. He's adding the stress to a word which shouldn't have the stress. So it should be clamosus es, not clamosus es. That sounds weird. And that's because he doesn't necessarily understand the syntax of the language. He has memorized the sounds of what to say and has the correct meaning in Italian in his head. This is an Italian actor, so he probably has the lines for him translated into Italian. So he is just basing it off of what that intonation would be in Italian. But that doesn't work directly mapped, moment for moment, within the phrase. You have to emphasize the right things, especially since Latin syntax is quite a bit different.
Tempus tuum transit rex segna.
Deine Zeit ist vorbei.
Tempus tuum transit. Sounds great.
De quo gratiam refero valde.
De quo gratiam refero valde. Sounds pretty good. This actor, like pretty much all of them, does not observe correct vowel length. That is the most critical part about Latin phonology because all of the grammar and the word structure is based around the lengths of the syllables. So other than that, it sounds pretty good.
En causa cur conditionem et tibi feram.
The character of varus has the word en more than a few times. The way he says it here sounds way too much like Spanish. It sounds like en causa instead of en causa. The en, that e has to be long, otherwise it sounds too much like in.
Arminio enim aliquid debes.
So with Arminio enim aliquid debes, there are two things that stand out to me in particular. One is emphasis. Enim is emphasized by quite a few of the actors when they're speaking. Enim, though, should not be emphasized. It's Arminio enim. It's basically something like an enclitic. And that's a mistake that even Latin speakers sometimes do because they just don't happen to know any better, and that's completely understandable. Arminio enim aliquid debes. So debes, the problem there is that the final es needs to have a long duration. A final es is often rendered short, particularly by the Italian actors.
Ocmodo tantum ille de te bonam eminerit.
A problem that a lot of the actors have is they don't know that final M is not to be pronounced as a clear consonant, creating a barbarism, something that non-native Latin speakers would do. It's called maiaticism, where they would pronounce the M sound, and at the end of the word tantum, in front of ille, it should be tantuille, not tantumille. The other issue is that there are a lot of length problems here, so the rhythm of the phrase is just absolutely critical to clear comprehension.
Eorum dux erat folquenus wolfsper.
When the actor here says erat, it's emphasized. Again, this is another word that ought not to be emphasized. And so when he says eorum dux erat, it sounds like their leader was folquen wolfsper, but isn't anymore. I mean, obviously because he's dead now, at least implied by the character here to the other character. But the emphasis should be something more like eorum dux erat folquenus wolfsper. There shouldn't be stress on that erat unless it has some kind of particular meaning. And this is really, again, the same problem because Latin syntax often is very different from that of English or German or Italian. Actors get this wrong every time. That's really the problem with this, and we're going to hit this again and again many times during this little conversation we're having. I highly favor this really authentic attempt to put Latin into a show like this. However, these problems will be regularly encountered because unless the actors have some kind of command of the language, they're probably going to get a lot of this wrong and it's going to sound really off. Again, who's going to care? You know, a few tens of thousands of Latin speakers who may be watching the show, sure. Other than that, I can understand why you wouldn't want to have to train all the actors how to speak the language fluently. Something else is really important to mention that a lot of people seem to misunderstand. This Netflix show was made for the German audience of Netflix, and we around the world watching Netflix also happen to get to watch it, which is great. So if you're an English speaker,
it wasn't made for him.
To quote a famous someone, that is to say, the reason that the protagonists, which are ancient Germans, are speaking modern German is not because they just decide to use modern German to try to do their historical thing. It's because they're speaking the same language that the audience speaks. This kind of trope is used all the time in cinema, where characters are going to be speaking in English or they'll speak in whatever modern language, even though it takes place long in the past. So just like, say, the movie Amadeus, where German is regularly replaced by English.
Your Majesty, I hope you won't find it improper, but I've written a little march of welcome in his honor.
But every other language in that movie, like Italian, remains Italian.
Herr Salieri composed this little march of welcome for you.
Really? Oh, grazie, signore. Sono commosso.
Grazie, signore.
In this show, the protagonists, which are speaking in an ancient Germanic language, are rendered with modern German because the actors are German and their audience is primarily German.
Pro explorator bebam, quod spem meam non esses deiecturus fili mihi.
Something I really love that the translator does regularly is that the original lines that he was given in German by the producers, he translated into a much more idiomatic sounding Latin. So like this, well done, that doesn't even appear. However, the sense of it, especially in the second sentence, is in all of the lines that the actor is reciting here. Pro explorato abebam, quod spem meam non esses deiecturus fili mihi. So I had it for certain that you wouldn't cast down my hope, my son. Excellent stuff. Wonderful Latin. The problem, of course, remains, as always, with the actor. Not because he's a bad actor. I think he's a great actor, but simply because he doesn't know the Latin language fluently, and that's fine. In particular, the phonology here for him is particularly troublesome. And that's because anytime he has a final consonant, like Italians kind of have to do unless they're well trained in phonology, they geminate the final consonant and they add a schwa vowel or something closer to an e sound. So when he says esses, it sounds more like esses. Esses. And deiecturus sounds more like deiecturuse. And because of that, it is just a pain in the behind to try to transcribe this, because every time he says something like quod spem meam non esses deiecturus, it sounds more like quod spem meam non esses deiecturus. And all those extra syllables drive me mad because they completely ruin the rhythm of Latin. This actor, among pretty much the whole cast, does this, especially the ones who are Italians. This is not at all unique to him. I have worked on productions trying to do my best to coach actors on how to pronounce things, and they work really hard, but everyone on the set has a lot of jobs to do. The actor's primary thing they're trying to do is to portray the character. And something like nailing the phonology of an ancient language that very few people speak fluently is not something that is going to be very high on the list of priorities. And given that, I do think the actors did really well in approximating the sound of classical Latin within the extraordinary limitations of time and training that they certainly had. So again, the various critiques that I have are not because these people are doing a bad job. It's because there are only so many things that are possible in any given production. So the critiques I'm making are mostly for the sake of education. Okay, this is a good representation of classical Latin, we may have heard before coming to see this show. And I say, absolutely it is. But that said, this is where I think it could be better. Not that I could possibly expect it for some lovely Netflix show, but that it definitely could be better given enough time.
Munere meo tantum sum perfunctus, multus bonos fratres, in Fauste amici.
So here this actor is German, and in general, I like his pronunciation the best among the whole cast. Now, number one, he is the main protagonist, so he's going to have to do most of the work, so it makes sense. And he's had to speak a lot of Latin, and it's not a language he knows fluently. Again, I think he's done a great job. Something that is also convenient is because of his accent, he ends up shortening all the syllables pretty much. Now, that makes all of them sound equally kind of short and long for the most part. And the way that compresses together when he speaks quickly, I can believe his accent of a foreigner speaking ancient Latin in antiquity much more than I could believe any of the native speakers of Latin who are the Italian actors. That is to say, he does things in his pronunciation that tend to approach classical Latin better, such as retracted S and certain syllable length things.
Asta omine rite fecisti. Cura ut Germania tota recte sciat qui cumostibus nostris sagam.
Despite the problems that we already mentioned, the thing that really stands out to me is cumostibus instead of quostibus. Final M is not to be pronounced solidly as a consonant in front of vowels or, of course, in front of the letter H.
Atque omni ex parte optume praemium tuum meritus esse.
I love that the translator decided to use optume. This occurs pretty frequently in the voices of the native Latin speakers because the transition of optumus into optimus isn't complete until later in the 1st century AD in most of the authors. And the pronunciation that comes out of the actor sounds pretty close to what this sonus medius should be. The middle sound in words like optimus or optumus, written both ways, right? So how should it have sounded? Probably something in between, optimus, optimus, or something like that. And it ends up sounding pretty close to that in any case, which is great. The complaint I have is, again, he says meritus es, and he stresses the S. You have earned, instead of you have earned. Meritus es.
Meritus esse.
Faciam nomen tuum Romae quam maxime honoratum pater.
Romam non redibis.
Confissus eram sortem meam Romae fore.
Another great sounding line. My complaint there is that the fore being stressed doesn't sound particularly natural to me. Romae fore sounds better. The verb to be, in this case, this is fore, to be in the future, tends not to get emphasized like that.
Inter imperium nostrum consecutus esse omni Armini. Omnia quae aliquis generis tui consequi potest.
Aliquis generis, that is incredibly annoying. Again, not because it's a foreign accent, but because it's adding syllables and thus transforming dramatically the rhythm of the line.
Aliquis generis mei?
And here the German actor, again, aliquis generis mei, he almost sounds Spanish, which is great, and especially with the retracted S that this actor happens to have natively, he actually sounds more even native ancient Roman in this particular phrase.
Barbara stirpe natus es.
Now, this show, I know it's called Barbaren, it's called Barbarians, and they want to make this point about, this is the point of view, the protagonists are the Germans, the so-called barbarians. But the fact that Varus here and the other various Romans constantly refer to the various Germans as barbarian instead of, say, German or Germanic or something, or as the Marsi tribe or whatever specific tribe, Kuruski, it comes off really strange. And I talk about this on one of my other channels about the actual story, about this series, actually reviewing the show, the finale in particular, and this concept of the barbarian in general. So go check out that video too if you're interested on what I thought about the show.
Locus tuus est hic in Germania.
Locus tuus.
Hic poteris Romam quam optime navare.
I absolutely love hearing navare. That is a great verb. We don't get nearly enough of it. Though I think the actor said something closer to navare.
Hic poteris Romam quam optime navare.
Rather than naware, which isn't consistent because most of the actors are pretty good about doing wa instead of va. If we get a little bilabial va, navare, that's okay. It's actually part of the transformation of the language in this period from this wa to a bilabial va sound, but never a va, never a labial dental sound. So it's, that's still a thing that's fine.
Hoc est fatum tuum. Daturus autem sum tibi quod aborigin est tuum, Armini. Tuum est rex gentis tuae fieri.
Now, the word rake is used in English, rake, and rex. This seems to be used here alternately than the word rex, meaning king. Obviously, this ancient Germanic term for ruler of a tribe is cognate through Indo-European with the Latin word rex. So I spell it variously here in my transcription.
Arminius rex ceruscorum. Ad hoc. Te alui.
BARBARIANS ut filium tuum alitum esse.
I'm pretty sure the actor here forgot the word me, because it's necessary for the grammar of a normal Latin sentence. Budaba me a te ut filium tuum alitum esse. I thought myself to have been raised by you.
Cerusquisiam rex est.
Cum rex egim eriam sum locutus. Ille est mente adem ac ego sum.
Same problems, and particularly the emphasis of that sum, ac ego sum, instead of ac ego sum. It's very strange.
Veteres lupinoscunt. Quando sibi tempus sit recedere.
Tempus sit.
Maxima viri gloria constat. Ex fine sua statuenda.
Let's hit on the problem again of syllable length, particularly vowel length. Ex fine sua statuenda. Ex fine sua statuenda. So the long vowels there, you can say this quickly, ex fine sua statuenda, but the long vowels need to have the proper length relatively. But just making them all the same length, ex fine sua statuenda, especially since making long vowels long where they're not stressed is not a natural thing for an Italian to do. It's something that an Italian in particular has to work on.
Salve Domine, unus egregaris tui superest.
Something that's really good and pretty consistent about what the actors do in the case of, say, gregariis, is they don't say gregariis. They don't put a glottal stop between the two letters I. That is a horrible thing that is often heard in all kinds of terribly pronounced Latin all around the world every day, especially in Germanic language speakers, notably native speakers of English or German. And we think, we Germanic peoples, for some reason, that there should be a glottal stop there, but there ought not to be. And I want to point out that is such a great thing about the pronunciation of all this. So much of it sounds good. Again, I know I'm nitpicking, which is, of course, the purpose of this, but I really want to emphasize how much I'm so happy to hear something like gregariis and not gregariis.
Dixit ne aliquid.
Jacet nunc in vulnerario.
This actor had a little bit of trouble of saying vulnerario. He said ulnerario because he interpreted the V. V is supposed to be a W sound, but starting a word with a W sound isn't necessarily a natural thing for either a German or an Italian actor.
Arcesse medicum, ego propeo maneo. Honesto funere eumuno.
Pater. Rabitum barbarum tenduisti.
Recte similis eis videri debeo, si rex gentis mea sum futurus.
Plane videris ne mente massuis.
So that was the Latin in episode 4. Let's take a look at the Latin in episode 5, the penultimate episode of season 1.
Armini, fili mi.
Pater,
Barbara tua mi, diuam dianam adequat.
The frequent use of the contraction mi for mihi is excellent and very classical.
et sibi honori ducere, quod in Roma elegati conspectum venit.
Ignoscatis oro. Iner senim sum hospita.
I love the ignoscati soro, a perfectly classical way to say, pardon me, excuse me, I plead you excuse me. It's great. The enim is again stressed, it's emphasized, and it needs not to be.
Ignoscatis oro. Iner senim sum hospita.
He says, iners enim sum hospita, instead of iner senim su hospita. Another thing in particular is that hospita is normally the feminine version of a host. You have hospes for masculine or feminine, and hospita is usually associated with the feminine, so I think the translator here was deliberately doing something in order to have fun with the line, because actually I've noticed the translator does a lot of things to add depth to the characters where it's not there at all in the, at least in the English subtitles, and thus most likely is something added that wasn't necessarily in the original German. So really subtle stuff. And this might be exactly one of those things.
Enad sunt quintus tribunus lati clauius.
More extra syllables instead of just making the long vowels long that need to be. So he says, enad sunt quintus tribunus lati clauius. Everything is fine except for those things. Also, the en needs to be long. Just enad sunt quintus tribunus lati clauius.
Lucius Eggus praefectus castrorum et pneumonius uala legatus legionis.
Pneumonius legatus legionis.
Tusnelda e pater est segestes enatione cheruscorum cliens imperio fidelis. Un barbaro te permutasti. Uxorem ipsam barbaram duxisti.
Barbara Popi? Che cosa?
Quanta incommoda pro imperio capimus.
Vix agnosco mi ipsum.
Non ne ueram tuam faciem modus tendis, Hermini?
Quintus here sounds pretty darn good. He's going to have some trouble with some lines later through, I would like to say, no fault of his own.
Arminius certe uerus Romae alumnus est. Videte, iam puero ius cupitus eras.
Cupidus eras. Because of that gemination of the final S of the cupidus, the rhythm is pretty off. It should be cupidus eras. Ba-da-ba-da-ba. Cupidus eras. Otherwise, I do like how these lines sound generally.
Princeps te creavit equitem Romanum.
An example of how the rhythm can sound outstanding, especially in the hands of an Italian, is with the creavit equitem. That sounds fantastic because the T naturally gets taken onto the next vowel beautifully. So Italians definitely can do that with aplomb.
Caius Iulius Arminius, eques Romanus.
Oh no, I made a whole video about this. Most certainly, the translator just wrote letter C period, followed by Julius. That's Gaius Julius. The letter C is just the archaic letter for G, because both C and G before the 3rd century BC were represented by the same shape, by the thing that we associate with the letter C. It's never, ever, ever pronounced Caius with a hard C sound, K, in Latin in antiquity. That is a pronunciation which came around, I think, the time of the Renaissance, inventing names like Caio, which still exists in Italian among other languages, as a complete hypercorrection, a mistake based on the notion that something like Gaius was, or Gaio, for example, was some kind of invention that came later, because letter C does become letter G and a bunch of other situations in Romance languages. So Caius is completely absurdly wrong, and I'm certain the translator just put C period, and this is, of course, that's the name Gaius, or incorrectly understood to be Caius by, sadly, a lot of people. They should have caught that one. That's a shame.
Gratias ago, pater.
I'm not saying our German actor here is somehow instantly better than the Italian he's playing against when it comes to these phonology things. He just happens to compress everything in such a way, along with a foreign accent that his character should have, that I find it more believable.
Tumultus illic propter tributa conferenda ardescunt ubique. Exploratores nostri in insidias creberrime incidunt.
Even reading my own transcription, which again was difficult to do because of the added syllables, man, they're confusing. Exploratores nostri in insidias creberrimi. But I keep hearing after he says exploratores nostri, exploratores nostri. It's so strange hearing that other syllable. And he says insidias creberrimi, and it throws me off so much because it sounds like there's another whole word in there, but there isn't. He's just geminating the final consonant and adding a schwa.
Tempus est nos cum subsidio tuo, pacem restaurare. A singulis rex singulos filios mi obsides afferto. Filis ablatis spes est ut intelligant denique isti.
Yeah, he super struggles with the final S's. A singulis rex singulos filios mi obsides offerto. I'm trying to exaggerate it just so you get the idea. This is especially not easy for Italians to hear. Most Italians hearing this will think, well, this sounds exactly like every teacher I heard in school. Exactly. And they do it terribly wrong. That's because they don't concentrate on ancient phonology. That's fine. Italians have a huge amount to offer, more than I dare say the rest of the native speakers of the various languages around the world can offer to the phonology of classical Latin. But man, Italians, they struggle with it so much.
Tudenu factus est idem, fili miei. Eamus agetum, praefecti nos expectant.
Recorum filios Arminius nobis offerre debuit.
Here we have a genitive plural, Latin style genitive plural, recorum filios Arminius nobis offerre debuit. And so that, anyway, I don't necessarily know the declension of what this rex is supposed to be in the story, and that's completely fine. Probably going for an ancient German kind of declension in some places as it's been adapted into Latin. Anyway, I'm just comfortable hearing, recorum. I know what that is.
Atubi sunt obside silli.
Marsorum princeps recusavit. Filium suum nobis obsidem dare. Ille exemplo induxit, auditem ceteri facerent.
Here, the actor's tendency to shorten syllables greatly definitely does not work in his favor, because we hear things like geteri facerent, but it's geteri facerent. So the long vowels here in the various places are definitely glossed over too quickly in quite a few places. Nevertheless, I really love the Latin. The translation is a lot of fun.
Questa rebellio.
Revera, qua propter audite, quae censeo.
Here the actor says audite, sounds like a double T. And this is a sort of compensatory lengthening, in this case of the consonant rather than the vowel. So it's audite. And again, I assume these actors, they learned all these lines months before they actually had to start doing the recording, because they had to block it, they had to get the costume test and everything. So should they make mistakes, and in fact, these mistakes are very consistent with that kind of thing. So he says audite instead of audite. So the length of the syllable he remembered, but not that it was a long vowel instead of a long consonant. So they're very interesting, because it's a linguistic phenomenon which demonstrates these kind of linguistic changes. By the way, for all of you out there like, where do you know how classical Latin sounded? Well, in addition to the feast of books behind me, which are all worth reading, I could definitely make a few recommendations. I primarily do just recommend the videos where I actually tell you how we know about the pronunciation of Latin in antiquity and indeed in any century. So we know that with great detail, so I'm reporting on what authorities have clearly demonstrated about this topic over hundreds of years of highly detailed research.
Hic est redinus noster ad vetera, sed hic in marsorum fines iter facimus.
Quid ergo?
Malem ignes parvos prius extinguere, quam silva tota sit exarsa.
Here the actor threw me off a lot, because I could have sworn he said bale, not, I wrote malim because I'm pretty sure it is in fact malim, or malem, potentially, probably malim though. Like I would prefer. And then with the way he shortens the ignes in just the ignis or something, and parvos, something he does a lot. I think it may be part of his German accent, which is, again, is fine for the character, because the character ought to have a German accent, even though it's not an ancient German accent. It is a foreign accent from the protagonist's language, right, which is represented as modern German. So it works. I'm not saying it's out of character, but it threw me off because the ignes parvos sounding like ignes parvus. I thought it was us, ignes parvus. I thought it was ignis parvus. Small fire. Again, I don't think this is even out of character. It just happened to cause me some difficulty, because it's definitely not proper classical Latin phonology, if you follow me.
Malem ignes parvos prius extinguere.
And I also am certain he really did say balim or something like that with a b in this very moment, or at least wherever he was recording the audio at the time. And I do think he was recorded here, the audio on set. So I believe he did actually say b instead of m. Why would that happen? Well, the same reason he probably said audite instead of audite, because months prior he memorized the dialogue, the meaning of it, he knew what was going on, and then he ascribed to it these sounds. Well, m is a bilabial sound, and m is the nasal version of the stop b. Like those are both bilabial sounds, m and b. So this is actually really interesting from a linguistic perspective because sometimes languages do change in ways like this. You even see it with some words with ancient Greek that have a m to b change, which are very interesting. There is absolutely no way that a foreigner would have actually done that because that's not consistent with the native Germanic language, with modern German, and so forth. This is just something where the actor is just going off of memory and is saying, is trying to do it as best he can and doing outstanding. These people do not know the language. They know their lines and they know them very well. So slip-ups of this nature do occur. Again, my self-appointed job here is to point out where things stray.
Arminius adet agmina declinemus, ut anc rem redditu nostro componamus.
Igitur, Ancalidius no est usquad vernum expectare.
I got confused here. I'm not exactly sure what some of the words are supposed to be. And I believe this is a symptom of the same thing that we've actually seen in some of the other actors. The fact that they've memorized their lines long before. Even if it were a day before, if you simply don't know the language, getting most of these sounds right is outstanding. And it's going to sound pretty authentic to 90+% of the audience. But I don't know what this verno is.
Usquad vernum expectare.
I assume it's supposed to be something like ad vernum or ad ver, to the spring.
Fines illi intra quos tu nos ducere suades aduc incogniti.
This line's intonation is another one where it just doesn't feel like what makes sense intonation-wise due to the fact that the actors don't speak the language, so they don't necessarily hit all the words the way that a fluent speaker would expect to hear them.
Maxima pars finium nobis incognita fuit, quinta. Tamen odie pars sunt imperii nostri.
His odie, the O is definitely too long. Interestingly, though, the translator specifically removes H's from certain characters, especially younger ones, the younger generation in this case. Arminius grew up in Rome, thus he represents a younger generation, which may not be pronouncing their initial H's with any consistency, whereas Varus, his adoptive father, pronounces the H's pretty consistently. So I'm pretty sure that is a decision made by the translator, and I love the effect. It's really nice.
Sic est quod Roma nunquam fuit incauta. Another
pause where I'm not sure if that was actually what the actor would have intended if he spoke Latin naturally. Maybe, and it's fine, but just that long pause before incauta. What did you think? I mean, especially if you know Latin, to me it just struck me as a little,
An metuis, tribuna, non quindecim milia liberorum Romae, a mille paucioribusque marsis licitentur?
I do not know what licitentur means. Reminds me of Ricky Tiki Taki.
Marsis licitentur?
I think this is supposed to be vincentur. It's not quite fear. Vincentur means they will be conquered. But I think that is what is intended here. I actually was puzzled for a long time, like, wikitentur, what could it be? And then with a lot of these puzzles that I've had that I can't quite figure out, I just write down the sounds and I give up on trying to figure out what the actual meaning is, especially because the English subtitles don't necessarily help because the Latin is very good idiomatic Latin and is not going to be, a word-for-word translation of the English necessarily. And because like wikitentur, how does that mean fear? And then when I looked at it kind of from a more bird's eye view, I said, it looks like vincentur. So I think that's supposed to be vincentur. So why is the actor saying wikitentur? For the same reason that these other mistakes seem to have crept in, especially in these later episodes. I assume this is towards the end of production. They're tired. Who knows how long it's been since they actually saw these lines for the first time. So making a little mistake like that is completely reasonable given the circumstances, given that the target audience is not fluent Latin speakers, it's Germans.
Debum igitur de re decretum, ut declinemus, castigemus, et te damus in barbaros exempla.
Abi!
Here is a place where I don't think the translator necessarily had all the information necessary to understand what was intended by the scene, or the blocking and the arrangement of the direction was altered later. Because he says abi, that means go away, to one singular person. But there are many guards here, so it doesn't make sense for him to say, Abi, go away, to just one of them. So probably the translator was given different information, or possibly there was some situation where Varus was only speaking to one guard, but they ended up changing it in direction later, and the line remained the same. And that's something where if actors actually know the language fluently, they'll know that what they're saying doesn't make sense, and they'll be able to give input to the director, say, hey, this doesn't make sense. Can we double check with the writer? In this case, we'd have to do it not just the writer, but the translator to make it make sense. But there are a few of these in the show where it's like, what? How that can't possibly make sense? And that's probably the reason. This is not the vision of one person. This is the collaboration of hundreds of people. So this is the inevitable result, especially with an ancient language. I cannot understand the last word of the sentence before he says barbare. If you can, let me know. It's possible he flubbed the word, or he is saying something clearly enough for him that I just can't make out. And this character, of course, is not meant to be a native speaker of Latin. I believe the actor is French, possibly. And anyway, the accent he has here is, it sounds like a foreign accent. So like I said before, foreign accents from the actors, they're not going to be like the accents of other ancient languages necessarily, because that's pretty hard to do. But I like that variety. All right, we're on to the final episode of the first season, episode 6 of Barbarians. Let's listen to the Latin.
Will euch in ein Hinterhalt locken. Vobes casses tendere, quae illud putre caput illic. Id prorsus non est caput, volcuni voesperi, vare. In diesem Lager, als...
Man, I just love the sound of some shouted German. Actually, I really like the sound of any German. But this actor's going all out. Just, I think it sounds great.
Arminius tibi mentitus est.
So he says, mentitus est. He has lied. Again, the same problem that a lot of the other actors have, where they emphasize an est or an s or a sum, which follows a participle of some kind, and it always sounds awful because it sounds like they clearly don't know what they're saying. The intonational pattern is, those kinds of emphases are hard to get. So, it's reason. I guess I understand, but it's really a shame because it's a pretty easy problem to fix with a relatively small amount of training, even if you don't know the language.
Volquinus vivit, ique in castris servit.
He says something else pretty cool. He says hique here, and he says hique with a very clear e. It sounds very much as I transcribe hique, and I am quite certain that the translator did this deliberately, where he wrote it this way, because this is the archaic version, and he wanted this character to have a few archaic speech habits. The consistency of those varieties is very noticeable to me. I do like those details a lot.
Verum est, ego te proditurus sum, pater.
Again, proditurus sum. I am going to betray you. Instead of I'm going to betray you, which sounds, I'm going to betray you. That's the normal intonation pattern. So, ego te proditurus sum. Of course, the vowels need to be long in certain places too, which this actor is not doing. But ego te proditurus sum. That is the kind of cadence we would expect.
Sic estis rectus, verus est. Me tribus legionibus Romanis, vel potius, militum quindecim millibus, casses tensurum, et quod plus est, caris barbaris meis adiuvantibus quingentis, universos eos messurum.
This is another example where he says universos. I guess it's because it's a short closed os for the native German actor, universos. It sounds like us. Because his us is very often an us, the o vowel. So because those are pretty close phonetically, especially in this actor's voice, I would have sworn he had actually said universus. But I know of course, I can read the rest of the transcription that I've done, and there's eos and so forth, so that I can tell that it's supposed to be universos eos. But this is a good example of why phonemic long vowels are so important. Even if he botched the vowel quality and said us or something, if it were long, it would make sense. So I just can't hammer enough how important phonemic vowel length distinctions are in Latin.
Ego aec faciam, equus imperii Romani, consilium meum est, oxane.
Here the actor, it sounds like he's trying to do something like, that's exactly my plan. The problem is that he puts the emphasis on the wrong words. Consilium meum, he says, consilium meum est hoc sane, as if that were like my plan, but it's not. Consilium meum est hoc sane. And he could have paused in other places, but the consilium meum est hoc, that kind of goes together. You could maybe break that up in a different way. Consilium meum est hoc sane. But the hoc sane doesn't really work.
Constat quide, pater, me tibi caput folquini volspere numquam atulisse.
Oh, another quidem emphasis. So quidem, enim. What else? Quidem, enim are the typical ones that end up being they're these post-positives that are they're the second thing in a phrase, and they are enclitic in nature. They ought not to be emphasized. So constat quidem, constat quidem. That is the natural kind of intonation one would expect.
Pro quo eus modifictum quodam supposui forquino simile, quem pariter constat in ergastulo vivere.
This, I think, is definitely another example of where the translator was adding something a bit different. Because the English here, which I assume is similar to the original German script that was made by the writers, instead, I brought you one that looked like him. Now, the Latin here is a bit different. Constat quidem pater, me tibi caput folquini volsperi numquam atulisse, pro quo eius modifictum quodam supposui folquino simile. Folquino simile. So, of course, the grammar is great and all that. Everything is just beautiful about the composition of this line, both its literary and simultaneous conversational style. The issue I have two. One is a pronunciation one. It says eus modi instead of eius modi, but that's another small point. He said the word fictum is put in here. Now, why is that? Latin is a more explicit language than English. Not because it's an ancient language, but that's because it's the nature of Latin. Other, even more ancient languages like Greek, ancient Greek, tend to be less explicit sometimes. Now, here, the word fictum is added, and this makes for better Latin prose. The more explicit Latin is, often the better prose it is. So what the translator may have assumed based on the text is that the head of Folkfin Wolfspeer was fake, and which is very interesting that the fictum, that means faked. So a mock-up or a model, fictum. So a caput fictum folquino simile, that I brought you a fake head that was similar to, and because that's from the verb fingo, fingere, to fashion. It's entirely possible that idiomatically this isn't at all what the translator necessarily intended, nor would the character here necessarily have to express that. So it sounds like what the translator was actually doing here was helping out the character, because here, it said, I brought you one that looked like him. Caput fictum quodam supposui folquino simile. The fictum part is great, because who but modern costume designers and other specialists could actually make a fake head? It's ludicrous, even in the modern day, where we actually have the technology and the techniques to do something like that. That's pretty absurd. In antiquity, no one's gonna do that. So basically, Arminius is able to throw this back at the argument of Segestes by saying like, oh yeah, obviously that thing up there on the pike looks just like Folkfin Wolfspeer. So I faked it. I brought you one constructed to look like him, as if it weren't even necessarily a real human head. Well, that's just fantasy. That's stuff that's in myths. That's why I think the translator here is doing a little tiny little thing that actually makes what the character is doing even more effective.
Qui potest aliteresse acita.
I also love the use of quae, which here doesn't mean the relative pronoun, but means how. How could it be otherwise? Excellent Latin idiom, excellent synonym choices.
Germane, si falsa tua contra filium meum iterum tantum repetitur ses.
I think this is the only time that Varus ever calls an actual German, German. I find that particular. I find it very interesting. I find it really weird that Varus keeps calling the Germans barbarian, and I know it's because we're trying to make him to be this mustache-twirling villain, which makes him to be very two-dimensional, in my opinion, boring villain. I talk more about that in my review about the show on the other channel. But that really stands out to me. It's like, now he's calling him a German? As if it's like an epithet. But it's literally what he is this time. Whereas the barbarian, that's the epithet.
Carum tuam obscaenam prope caput falcuni volsperi in asta summa fixero ipse.
So here's something cool. He says, Caram tuam obscaenam prope caput fulquini volsperian hasta summa fixero ipse. Great stuff, beautiful Latin, but he says, Caram. And I'm like, the deer, your obscene deer, what, faciem? So, because Caram is deer, and tuam obscaenam, these are all adjectives. The word for head, it couldn't be that, because that would be neuter. It would be carum tuum obscaenum caput, and the word caput isn't here. Instead, but the caram, and then I really thought, wait a minute, this sounds like Spanish. La cara, that means face in Spanish, but that's not how it is in other Romance languages other than in Iberia. This is a very strange thing. Could that be? And I looked up the etymology and found that cara, that's used in Spanish, is actually from Greek through a version of informal Latin, sometimes called vulgar Latin, which means all kinds of different things. Don't get me started on vulgar Latin. And here, it's not actually caram, but it's caram. This is a word for head in colloquial ancient Greek, and many, many colloquial ancient Greek words worked their way into Romance languages, including Spanish. And another example, if you want one, is cada, like cada dia, every day. That's from the Greek kata, like kata he mera, or in modern Greek, kathimera, every day. So kathimera, cada dia. So here the translator has deliberately used a word that was in common ancient Greek as a kind of more emphatic, somewhat vulgar, not in the linguistic sense, but in the profane sense, word to use more pejoratively with this fellow that he clearly doesn't like. So caram instead of caput. I think that is such a great choice. Now, as far as I know, cara isn't attested in Latin until much later, but it is a part of the ancient Greek language, so there's no reason it couldn't be a word that this character uses. I actually did the same thing, adding in a few Greek words to the speech of the Roman soldier character in the interview with the legionary video. So check those out on my other channel, Scorpio Martianus. Here again, the translator has auferte. Maybe the German was changed later, not just to take him away, but sort of be gone. So those are very different. He's not commanding segestes, he's commanding his guards, take him away. This is another pretty distinct example of the Italian gemination plus schwa. Adduetera, especially also the initial va being an u vowel, which is pretty much mistaken. That sounds so. Adduetera is what it sounds like, and that sounds adeuetera. Very, very odd sounding instead of adduetera.
In barbaros istos exempla romana edemus ad Teutoburgiensem saltum.
Ad deuto, that kind of thing is irritating to me. Can't expect that much because everybody's going to have some native accent qualities in our Latin, but still I find it very irritating. Adde, that double sound plus the schwa.
Pro suasi terminus, ordine solita. Fili mi, aulis per inte dubitave confiter, egenosque scusa.
I do not exactly hear what he said. He says ignosce, maybe ignosces, but ignosce excusa, maybe sorry, pardon, put together.
Forsaneit peristam execratam Germaniam stat.
I get most of the words here. Forsan, peristam, execratam, Germaniam stat. But ait, that can't be the verb. Whatever the verb is, I'm not quite sure. What do you hear?
Execrata Germania.
Ixumus, pater. Legio ad sinistram.
Legio ad sinistram.
Iusatue quae sunt. Tegenda latera. Solve.
Praevere cum equis situis exploratum de agnecerto Armini.
This is the passive imperative because wehor means I ride. Literally means I am carried. I was wondering because it sounded off too with the not being passive. I knew there was something off here, but I think it's just that I'm not listening closely enough. So praevere means the imperative. That's the imperative for the passive. So be carried forward in front, or literally ride ahead. So praevere. And the H is just not necessarily clear, especially in this environment. It sounds like they're capturing the sound right here outside, wherever they're filming. So praevere actually works just fine.
Itaque imperium nostrum in rusticis istis exempla Romana est editurum. Procertus quio me tibi credere possem, pone puer.
I do have things to say about this in my review of the finale on the other channel. However, here, I think the translator has done something especially good and subtle yet again. He says, not mi bone figli, which would be a direct translation of what we see here, my good son, but he says, mi bone puer, my good boy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, mi bone puer. One could absolutely say that, father to son, just as one can say that in many other languages. It's perfectly natural. However, puer is also the word for slave in Latin. Rather, there is the word servus, and there are actually quite a few words, not surprisingly, for slave in classical Latin. Puer is used pretty often, and it's pretty similar to something like garçon in French, which is used to mean waiter, like we've heard like garçon, waiter, that kind of thing, right? So I think what the translator did, because this Varus character is meant to be a bad guy, I think two-dimensionally, but an extra layer is put in here because this is the moment where we, the audience, are supposed to empathize with Arminius making this incredibly grave decision to get thousands of what used to be his people killed, including Varus, potentially, and ideally, this adoptive father. However, Varus here, with all of his pejorative terms that he's been using the whole time, makes it yet easier in the Latin version because he doesn't say mi bone fili, he says mi bone puer. And as much as we see this really affecting Arminius, he actually throws up because of the magnitude of what he's about to do. I think that's a really good writing choice, actually, because it gives a lot of depth to the Arminius character. Varus calling him puer, which again is a legitimate thing for father to say, it's also something that you could call a slave. And because of that, I think it helps Arminius to clarify what he's about to do. This man, he loves me just like he loves his slaves. The ancient Romans apparently did love their slaves like children in a super weird way. And that's something that the character clearly resents. And all of that is packed into a super subtle word choice by the outstanding translator, Alessandro Balistrieri. So, tremendous compliments to him for this entire magnificent work.
A Caesare accipi.
I love that he literally says, I got that from Caesar. That sounds so much more colloquial instead of a gift from Caesar. I love it. Great job, translator.
Ices sumbolus equitis Romani, siginum imperi potestatis, militiae dominationis.
The same problems with Varus as always. Hic est symbolus. Now, the fact that he says symbolus, this nice U or U sound is great instead of symbolus or something. So I do appreciate that, but the schwas and the extra S's are irritating. Est symbolus equitis, then Romani instead of Romani. The same usual problems.
Siginum imperi potestatis, militiae dominationis.
He also says siginum, and that's pretty funny sounding. The GN ought to be more like signum, and I talk about this in the GN video. Signum. That would work. Instead, because you try and do this hard G in front of the N isn't a normal thing for an Italian to do anyway, so he comes up with this siginum, and it sounds pretty funny instead of signum.
Recte me persuasum teoli meum tibi meriturum. Glorica mea, factus est liber.
And with that, we have heard the Latin in episodes 4, 5, 6 in the second half of the first season of Barbarians. Do go see the reviews I did of the Latin for episode 1, episode 2, and episode 3. And come back because very soon I'm going to be reviewing the Latin that we get to hear in the second season of Barbarians, and that'll be here very soon. So thank you so much for liking, subscribing, and sharing. For now, I'll just say, valete.
Sono stanco di te, ti do un pugno nella testa! Ti uccido con questa carne!